This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Brian Cremins. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
I'm Andy.
And I'm Gene, and we're three guys with PhDs talking about comics. Actually, four guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right, because the subject of this interview episode is Brian Cremins. He is the author and a PhD of the new book, Captain Marvel and the Art of Nostalgia, which has just come out from University Press of Mississippi. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off at the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But many times you can find discounts that go higher than that.
And Bundle Madness this month includes several things. Nothing goes higher than 50% this month, but there's a lot at 50, including a DC Hanna-Barbera bundle. I've heard frightening and also good things about those comics. I haven't seen any of them yet. Also a DC Young Animal bundle. I'm actually liking some of the Young Animal titles, so that would be worth checking out. Marvel's Secret Empire bundle. I don't know what to think about that or feel about it, but it kind of makes me scared. But there's a Valiant bundle. There's all kinds of, there's Marvel Kids bundles, DC Kids bundles. There are so many bundles, you won't know where to start. So just grab them all.
That's right. You're going to be bundled out by visiting the website of our sponsor. Go to dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs, bundled and otherwise. And after you do get your books there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the three guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
So this was a fun conversation that we had, and actually this is something that I think, Andy, you came up with and initiated.
Yeah, well, I'd been talking to Brian. We last ran into each other at the CXC event in Columbus, Ohio, where we were part of the academic portion of that, and Brian gave a paper that's a part of this book. And so we were talking about when the book came out, and I said we should have you on the show.
And that's good because, you know, we do a lot of interviews on the Comics Alternative, but we hardly do any interviews of writers who have done scholarly work, sometimes critical biographies, things of that sort, yes. But it's not often that we get a fellow scholar, a comic scholar, on the show for an interview.
Yeah, this one's special for me too, because Brian and I actually went to graduate school at the University of Connecticut 5,000 years ago, or I guess it's 21 years ago at this point. And so Brian and I have been talking comics for a long time, usually over back issue bins and things like that. So it was very cool to read his book and enjoy his book as much as I did, and then get to talk to him with you guys and to kind of dig into the story behind it. I've heard a lot of it over the past couple of years since I've lived in Chicago here. But to actually have the book and have him kind of tell these stories from beginning to end is really special for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go ahead and listen to that conversation.
Yep.
Chosen from among all others by the immortal elders Solomon, Hercules, Atlas, Zeus, Achilles, Mercury, Billy Batson and his mentor travel the highways and byways of the land on a never-ending mission to right wrongs, to develop understanding, and to seek justice for all. In time of dire need, young Billy has been granted the power by the immortals to summon awesome forces at the utterance of a single word. A word which transforms him in a flash into the mightiest of mortal beings, Captain Marvel.
So we're here tonight with Brian Cremins, who is an associate professor of English at Harper College and the author of the recent book Captain Marvel and the Art of Nostalgia from University Press of Mississippi. So thanks for joining us, Brian.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah, welcome.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I guess one of the first questions to start with is why write a book? Why write an academic book about Captain Marvel?
It started off as a different idea for a different project. It was originally only supposed to be one chapter in what I thought would be a book on comics and mysticism or spirituality. So I had an outline that included sections on James Sturm's The Revival and Edie Fake's Gaylord Phoenix, and so I think a Will Eisner section. And I had a section where I made a note to myself that said, well, maybe also do something with Captain Marvel and CC Beck. And at some point I looked at the whole outline, and I'd already written the Edie Fake chapter as a separate article. And I said, I think I'm the only one that's going to want to read this book, because it was sort of my version of Paul Schrader's Transcendental Style and Film, that book from the 70s. And I sort of wanted to do a comics version of that. So I had this list of people and that I'd wanted to write about. And again, I didn't think anyone else would want to look at it. And at some point I said, well, wait a minute. What if I just take the chapter that's supposed to be on Captain Marvel and Beck and turn that into a whole book project? And so that's where it came from. I'd had some ideas about it for a couple of years, but it was around, I guess, the middle of 2012 that I decided to try to see what I could find on that particular topic, and then sort of just took it from there.
So that explains the Captain Marvel side. Can you talk a little bit about the idea of nostalgia that you see as connected to the Captain Marvel as a character and as a superhero phenomenon?
Oh, sure. That actually stretches back quite a long ways. I looked recently at the first academic article I'd published on comics, which was for John Lent in the International Journal of Comic Art in 2002. And Gene will remember that because that's the paper I presented at the PCA up in Toronto that year. And so, yeah, that's still one of my favorite conferences. That was just amazing. There's elements in that about nostalgia and how these comics were part of this larger historical tradition. So I went back and skimmed that essay recently. I said, well, here's the whole book, basically in miniature, 15 years ago. So I'm either very consistent or just very repetitive, in what I do, because it was sort of mapped out in some ways there. But after I'd read Bart Beatty's book, Comics versus Art, he has that section about those collectors from the 1960s and their sort of fascination with nostalgia. And what struck me about that chapter, as much as I admired it, was that it wasn't looking into the actual theories of nostalgia that have been around for quite a while, particularly in the last, I would say, 20 years. And that's not to take away from that chapter, because that's clearly not what Bart was up to in that book. But I started to get more interested in searching out what the actual academic work on nostalgia coming out of memory studies, for example, would be, and started reading people like Svetlana Boym, who had a huge impact on the book, and going back and reading Johannes Hofer's 1688 dissertation, on the subject, which actually coins the word for the first time, and that opened up a whole other kind of a portal, or a new subway station, if you want to use the Billy Batson, metaphor. And what was interesting is as I found more about Beck, particularly his later writings that were unpublished, when Trina Robbins was kind enough to share those with me, all those essays from the Critical Circle, it became increasingly clear to me that he himself was really fascinated with these questions of childhood nostalgia and the nostalgia that his fans had for these comics from the 1940s and 1950s, because he increasingly was writing about these subjects towards the end of his life. And so that was there in the critical work that he was doing. And so it seemed to cross over well with the outside research I was doing on nostalgia itself. And I think initially I conceived of that aspect of the book as being relatively small. I didn't think it would take on as much of a significance as it eventually did, where it takes up, not only the introduction, but the entire last chapter of the book on nostalgia and fanzine culture, because there was just such a rich amount of material on the idea of nostalgia that I had no familiarity with, other than a little glancing knowledge of it from Marianne Hirsch's work, particularly on Maus from Family Frames, which is another book that really is part of the foundation of the way that my book is structured. Is her work on Spiegelman really had a major influence on the way that I conceived of this book as it kind of progressed. So I was really trying to bring in those two different strands from those two different places, in addition to putting in the archival material, since I enjoyed doing archival work so much. So I had all that, the Binder letters and the Beck letters and all the old fanzine materials. So it was a challenge at the end to try to integrate all those pieces.
Now, so you're talking about the significance of nostalgia when you're looking at C.C. Beck and his critical writings.
Yeah.
That you allude to quite a number of times, especially in the chapter devoted to Beck. Is there something about the character of Captain Marvel that lends itself to a study of nostalgia in ways that other figures in comics do not?
I think so, and this again I didn't anticipate this when I started looking at it more closely. Because originally, when I had the idea on the spirituality and transcendentalism, I thought of Captain Marvel as a kind of character that was part of this tradition of these disembodied heroes, like you'll find in even Jack London's The Star Rover, where the convicted criminal is like traveling into past lives, right? Or some of those Robert E. Howard stories where the character, I forget his first name, his last name is Allison, and he's projecting himself back into the past because he's incapacitated. So I originally thought it would be connected to other work I'd done on dissociation and comics. But I realized when I went back and actually read the origin story by Parker and Beck from 1940, that historama that Billy sees, that Shazam shows him, was a perfect emblem and image of this nostalgia that collapses past, present, and future, because Shazam lets him actually see the past, where he's cast out by his evil uncle who takes his fortune away from him, and at the same time sees his present and also possibly his future. So it seemed embedded in the original story, not only in that opening scene, but also in the fact that Bill Parker, when he was on the stand in 1948 during the copyright infringement case with National, said that he drew a lot of inspiration from it, for that story from the King Arthur narratives and myths, which are to me all about nostalgia and this sense of a world that has passed away and cannot be recovered in anything other than the imagination. So I do think it's embedded in the character in a way that is not necessarily there in other characters, particularly from that period.
Well, that's interesting. What you say about the nature of the character itself. Something that struck me, and I want to throw your words right back at you, Brian.
Yeah, sure.
You say, why not? In the chapter Billy Batson in World War II, you say, I'd argue that Billy does not transform into an adult superhero. Rather, Shazam's magic enables him to revert to a more innocent state of being. Yeah, and that also just feels like that's just imbued with nostalgia right there. Also,
sure. Yeah, that kind of innocence. Because really, if you look at those World War II stories, as I say in the book, and I think Bradford Wright says this in Comic Book Nation too, Captain Marvel's not the brightest character. Billy's actually smarter, right? I mean, there's that story that I talk about in the World War II chapter, Gene, that you just mentioned, where Captain Marvel gets duped in the alternate universe into signing a pact with Adolf Hitler.
Right.
becomes a Nazi. But Billy's the one who, when he's not Captain Marvel, is like, oh my God, what did he just do? How am I going to get us out of this? So it is like he is more innocent when he transforms. He's not actually an adult, and he's not even as smart as he is when he's the newsboy. He's not as savvy. He gets more inept in some ways, at least in some of those stories.
So it's like the power needs to be tempered by the brains of the boy, sort of, or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And the premise being that this ancient wizard would only have given him the power if he thought he was capable of it. So for some reason, he never explains.
So the power is kind of stupid.
Yeah, right. I mean, and the power, and this is what Beck said later on. I mean, Beck in those critical circle essays, and I really emphasize this too, and was surprised when I found it. He said, as far as he was concerned, they weren't really superhero stories because he didn't particularly like superhero stories, and he also thought that it was quite possible that all of them were just narratives in Billy's own imagination, which also seemed really evocative to me. And that could be retrospective, that could be something where he was reflecting back. But there certainly is an element when Otto Binder comes in to the stories that have this, as I mentioned too, this kind of Walter Mitty quality. I mean, they do have a Mr. Tawney story that does play on the Walter Mitty fantasy narratives in that James Thurber short story. So I think when Binder comes in, it does become a very different kind of a character than early on when it's Parker writing it, or even when Simon and Kirby are doing some of those early Captain Marvel adventure issues, because he brings a lot of the literary qualities to it and a lot more of that childlike kind of innocence. Because you have to remember, he and Beck were a lot older than a lot of the other creators from that period. I mean, they considered themselves professionals who already had careers before they started making comics, or were asked in Beck's case to actually come in and create a character or co-create a character for the company.
Yeah, so in the Batson Captain Marvel relationship, it's child is father to the man.
Yeah, exactly. Nice Beach Boys reference too. Nice.
Yeah. Actually, I was thinking more of Wordsworth, but hey, I'll take Brian Wilson.
I'll take Beach Boys.
You do talk about this a bit in the book, but from what you're talking about there about this kind of essential nature of the Captain Marvel character being part, and that's part of, it seems, its success at the time in World War II.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a drawback for the revivals of Captain Marvel that have come about since then?
Oh yeah, I think I said this to someone else recently. I think trying to revive the character is kind of like anyone that's tried to take Sherlock Holmes and revive him. Sometimes it can work, like the Nicholas Meyer novels, like 7% Solution, which is a great book. But it's still not Arthur Conan Doyle, right? And I feel like it's really the same thing with trying to take him as a character and trying to do something else with him. It just doesn't work, because I think the creative relationship between Binder and Beck and Pete Costanza as Beck's assistant was really unique and really brought a lot to the character. And without them, it really is just a property. I mean, it's a property that has undergone various changes over the years. And I think Beck himself realized that when he tried to go back, speaking of nostalgia, in the early 70s, and, drew those first 9 or 10 issues for DC, and was deeply unhappy with it, and clearly missed the camaraderie that he had, not only with Binder, but with the rest of the Fawcett folks. Because as I try to mention in the book, and as Bill Shelley really elaborates on in his biography of Binder, it was a really close-knit community. Those Fawcett freelancers, particularly centered on Binder's house in Englewood, New Jersey, had parties together. They hung out together. They all knew each other really well. And I think that intimacy comes through in the stories, particularly in the late 40s, into maybe the early 50s. And I don't think you can duplicate that. I don't think it's possible to do it. And it just does become a property that's replicated again and again to keep the trademark, or to keep keep the ownership of those characters.
That's unfortunate what you're saying about Beck's feelings about the revival in the early 1970s with Captain Marvel in the Shazam title, because, I have a particular affinity for the character of Captain Marvel. I remember that those 1970s Shazam comics were some of the first I remember getting and reading. Yeah. I know my mother would push on me Superman, because that's what she, and Little Batman when she read as a kid.
Right.
But I remember going to the local 7-Eleven on the spinner rack, and the Shazams are that was one of the titles that I would always gravitate to. So of course I have, speaking of nostalgia, warm feelings for that run, that revival. Too bad that it didn't meet Beck's expectations.
No, and I agree with you. I've told this story before. I think I told it at ICAF last spring, but I really had no childhood nostalgia for this character. I knew of him as this kind of, in the book, I have the T-shirt on, at my birthday party that my mom probably bought on discount at Marshall's in Watertown, Connecticut. But for me, he was a character that was that live action late 70s TV show that would come on at the end of Saturday morning, which meant that all the cartoons were over. So it was the end of Saturday morning, and the golf would come on at like 12 o'clock, and I'd have to watch that. So I didn't have a particularly fun.
Not bowling for dollars?
No, or whatever we had back in Connecticut. So I didn't have a real fondness for the character, because people have asked me that when I've talked about the book. But to go to your saying, Derek, it was those Shazam comics. I found a whole run of those at and Gene will remember Hal Kinney's conventions at the Elks Hall up in East Hartford, Connecticut, right? And so
super high-powered comics conventions.
Yeah, which is why when I finally went to Wizard World a couple of years ago with Eugene, it freaked me out because I was used to these really small local conventions, and so you'd find these for a quarter, and I read those in the late '90s, and loved them. I like the Denny O'Neil stories in them. I like the reprints of the Binder story. So, I feel the same way. For me, they were a way into a character and a mythology that I knew about from reading comics for so many years, but didn't have any particular affection for until I read those stories. And even Beck's new work, I think he underrated the kind of work he was doing. And if anything, I think what he was really sad about was the fact that Binder wasn't there. I mean, and he says that in some of his his essays later, that it just was not the same. And it wouldn't have been the same. There was no way Binder was going to come back and write for comics. As he says in that letter to Julie Schwartz, in one of those issues, I think it's number 4 or 5 of Shazam, he said it's a dream. It's a long lost dream. I'm paraphrasing him here, and it's not something I want to go back to. And that was particularly how he felt after the death of his daughter, which I'm sure you talked about with Bill when you did the interview with him last year, which is a real tragedy that just destroyed the family at the end of his life.
It's funny that we're getting straight to that 70s revival, because that's my primary connection was having a bunch of those too. And the one I just really have a very, very specific memory of is, I think it's issue 30, where it's part of that series where Captain Marvel's going to different cities.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And I think he goes to Pittsburgh and he fights Joe McGarrick,
right?
And I don't know. There was something about, like, even there's a scene in there where Joe McGarrick takes spreads his fingers apart through molten steel and makes girders, and that image just stuck with me. I think I must have gotten that comic like on a family trip or something, and didn't have many other comics with me, so I read it and reread it over and over again.
Oh, sure. And was that I have that in a box here somewhere. Is that Schaffenberger that drew that one, or was?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, which are great. I mean, I think my very first exposure to the character was the kids book that he drew for Western
Women?
Publishing. I forget, it's Captain Marvel and the Circus or something. I have it. That's over on my shelf. The Schaffenberger drew. And I probably couldn't read even when I got that book and I found it. And my mom still had a copy of it. So no, I have a lot of affection for that period, despite Beck's distaste for it.
Mm-hmm.
Brian, you mentioned earlier. First off, we should probably clear the air. Brian and I have known each other for 25 years.
Oh yeah, at least.
This is we met as we young grad students at the University of Connecticut way back in the moldy oldie days.
Yeah, and I think it was it would have been the fall of '96, because that's when I was started in my master's program in the fall of '95, but became a teaching assistant that fall.
Okay, so you have a better memory for these numbers and years and things like that.
Well, I remember. So go ahead.
I was going to say, but again, I've kind of seen how your obsession has grown with this stuff. And I didn't want to do the nostalgia stuff. What I want to do is say that one of the things that really impressed me about this book is the kind of archival stuff you mentioned before, that you really like doing the archival research.
Yeah.
If you can you talk about that process a little bit, because this book is full of things that I think a lot of people who are coming for a book about Captain Marvel are not going to expect.
Oh, sure. When I started it, my first way in, other than reading those comics, was I took a look first at the Steranko History of Comics, because he has a lot of good archival material in there. And I think, and I was not able to confirm this because I was never able to get a hold of him, but I think he also still owns, or at least possesses, a lot of Binder's letters and papers, the ones that are more comics related. That's my impression, because the first bit of archival research that I did for the book, after just reading some of the material that was out there, was in Binder's other papers that are housed at the at Texas A&M University. Because when he passed away, Sam Moskowitz, the editor and fanzine science fiction writer, inherited a lot of that work, and most of what I saw in the Texas archive at the Cushing Memorial Library there is primarily his science fiction related correspondence. So they have all the letters that he wrote in the 1930s when he was first publishing in places like Amazing Stories, and then it picks up again in the early 50s when he's trying to get back into the field, which I talk about a little bit in the chapter on him. And so that was really the starting point there. And then I did a lot of work in person up in Michigan State, thanks to Randy Scott, who first shared work with me 14 years ago when I was writing on Tim Truman and Scout. So I was asking him for information even as far back as then. And we were up there, and I was in the archive, and I was looking through the back clipping file. And this was one of the kind of magical parts of this process. One of the interns, or one of Randy's assistants, was going through a box of Cat Ironwood's papers. And he turned to me and he said, "Are you looking for somebody named Beck?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." He said, I have one of his letters here to Cat, because she had just donated a lot of her papers to the archive. And so it had an illustration of him and Cat, and had it was his invitation to her for the Critical Circle. And he mentioned Trina. And so I said, "Oh, wait a minute. I bet you that these letters are out there, these Critical Circle letters." So I wrote to Trina. And she immediately wrote me back via email and said, "I have all the letters. I've saved them all these years." She's like, "I'm going to mail you the box." She's like, "I just want you to promise that you'll copy them and send them back to me. Don't lose them."
That's amazing.
Wow, it's like having an archival library come directly to you.
Yeah. So aside from all that stuff, I'd already found it, through the Cushing, and then up thanks to Randy. And if you've ever met Randy, and I'm sure you all have, he's like Shazam. I mean, he takes you into the first time I went in there, I'm looking through all the paperwork, and he said to me, I'll never forget this. He said, "Brian, I like you because you like all this trivial stuff." I said, "Well, that's kind of the story of my life. I like all this kind of ephemeral stuff." And then he said, "Do you want to jam?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." I said, "I didn't bring my guitar." And he takes me into his office area at the back of the archive, and he's got a drum set and an upright bass. And he said, "Don't worry, I've got a guitar." He said, "Here, play this." He's got a piano in there. He brings a couple of people from other departments on campus. So it's the only time I've ever done archival research where I got to jam with someone who kind of looks like Shazam in the middle of the archive. But it's those kind of what I guess Walter Benjamin would call secret affinities that I love so much about doing that kind of archival work, where it's just by chance, or maybe not by chance, given that the Cat does a lot of root work and magic. That her papers just happen to be there.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and and even to go back like years ago, I kind of got my early fascination with that old material when I was a subscriber to the Comic Buyer's Guide, when I was a kid in the 80s, and I had like a 7-year subscription to it. I was reading it even after I kind of stopped reading comics for a while. And what I loved about it when it was being edited by Don and Maggie Thompson was the fact that, they'd have the ads and they'd have the kind of battles amongst fans, but they also always would have articles by people like Will Murray, so he'd be writing pulp magazines, and so they'd have those histories. You'd have Don Thompson writing reviews of Mouse and the most recent issue of X-Men. So I think a lot of my sensibility came from that weekly reading, where I would get fascinated by these old, archival work. And I say that partly because in high school, I wrote a letter into the Buyer's Guide, which I also found when I was up at the archive in Michigan. And I forgot that in high school for my Spanish class, I had to do a project on Spanish language comics. So I wrote in and And Tom Inge, wrote back to me and said, here's some material. I wish I still had that letter. And I didn't know who Tom Inge was. I mean, when I saw him at the Billy Ireland opening a few years ago, I was too scared to even talk to him because he had such an impact on me. Just the fact that he would take the time out of his schedule to send a package of material and suggestions to some high school student in the middle of Waterbury, Connecticut. That really stuck with me over the years, I think that kind of undergirds the book as well. Those early experiences where I would, you'd correspond with people like him or with Kat Ironwood. I remember her sending me a box of comics in the late 80s when I was complaining in the letters column of the Buyer's Guide how bad comics were after the black and white implosion, So that kind of generosity and openness was really stuck with me. And it was the same thing I found, honestly, when you and I met at UConn, because I had been out of comics for a while until I met you guys up at Stores. Not to get too nostalgic or sentimental, but that really got me back in. I think you guys suggested I get a copy of The Revival by James Sturm, and I was back in. I said, okay, this is what I've been waiting to see all these years,
Yeah, there were a few field trips to local comic shop, to generally local comic shops, because nothing is that local up in the northeast Connecticut. But
right.
Getting back to Randy Scott for a second, one of the stories, or a couple of the stories I like to tell the couple times I've been there. The first time I went, and I was reading a bunch of Black Hawk comics, and he came up to me about 3-4 days into my week that I was there, and with all these eBay printouts, and he said, I don't know if you're coming back, but if you ever do, I just ordered all these Black Hawk comics.
Damn.
Sounds like Randy.
So I feel like I had to come back. But then there was one day I was sitting there. He goes, "You just out of the blue." He says, "You want to read Detective Comics 26?"
Oh, wow.
I'm like, 26? Yeah. So he pulls it out, and pieces of it are coming off on me, Wow. And I was reading through that, and it's like number one, this book's never going to get reprinted. Number two, Slam Bradley sitting in the front of that book like a smug bastard, thinking he owns the place, and that's not going to stick around. Was there like a blurb for coming next issue, The Batman, or anything like that? I don't remember that at all. But anyway, yeah. So that I always think of going there as like a vacation more than an actual research trip. Because you just sit in a room and read old comics for a week. I can do that.
It's really magical. Even we also enjoyed the botanical gardens that are right outside of the library. That I did not expect. I was walking across campus, and you're in this beautiful garden with all these interesting plants. So I of all, to go back, Gene, to your question about the archival work, that stands out to me as a really special moment when I knew that there was something more there than what I had anticipated, which was a relief because I already had submitted the proposal for the book. But there was just more there. There was more depth to what I was finding than I had anticipated, and that's when things get really exciting. As you all know, in these kind of projects.
And you also get into like court records and stuff like that. Also, you're not just doing comics research.
No,
not comic book research.
Oh, and I forget. Yeah, that was another adventure. Luckily, and Gene, you know this because you've met him. But my dad was a corporate attorney for 23 years, and then he's been on the bench and as a Superior Court judge in Connecticut since the late '90s. And so sounds
like he said a superhero judge.
Yeah, yeah, right. And you couldn't have asked. I couldn't have asked for a better research assistant because once I figured out that those court records were in the National Archives, and I could access them in Lower Manhattan. I said, "Hey, do you want to take a trip down to New York and look through these? Because I'm not going to know what I'm looking at, And so it was really great. I didn't have a lot of time to spend on them. There's 9-10 boxes worth of transcripts that are really fascinating. The depositions and then all the court records. But I got just enough to be able to put in that material from Parker, and he gave me some great advice too. I asked him what he thought of the results of the case, and he read the judgments, and he said, "Look," do not try to relitigate this. He said, "You've got, Learned Hand is one of the greatest thinkers in 20th century American jurisprudence. You're not going to better his decision on appeal from the early 50s. He said, so just tell the story. And he said, if others want to try to do that, he said, that's fine. If they want to, determine who was right or wrong, but he said, just tell what's there and then move on from there. And that was great advice. Originally, that material from the archive took up a whole chapter onto its own. But I realized when I was doing the final edits that it had to go. It was weighing the whole book down. It was really not part of the story that I was trying to tell. So I moved it all to the beginning, and again took my dad's advice. I said I'll just make this part of the narrative and then move on to it after a couple of pages.
Yeah, because that interesting stuff. I don't know if you're going to ever do anything with more of that because you said you cut a lot of that out. But like on page 5, you mentioned how National almost lost the copyright on Superman and had to get it back by appeal.
Yeah. I
don't remember hearing that story before.
Yeah, and it's been written about. That the first person.
I'm thick.
Yeah, no, but it's been written about in really obscure places. So the first person to write about it, I think Steranko might mention it a little bit in his history books, but Michael Uslan talks about it. But it's in Amazing World of DC Comics, from the mid 70s. So, unless you've got a collection of those, you're not going to see it because he does a good rundown of the case.
Let me just reach to my shelf, but
yeah, Gene, you probably got it. Yeah. And then, there was another article in Alter Ego where, there and I forget, it's one of the Laws and Ask columns that was adapted. And that one also, I got the book in front of me now. I have to remember. I'm forgetting the name of the writer that talks about that one. My memory is blanking out on me. But it had appeared twice over the course of the last 20 years. No, he wrote. Oh, Bob Ingersoll. Jeez,
Ingersoll.
Yeah, Bob Ingersoll did a really nice summary of the case. That's very lucid, which is why I cite it quite a bit in the opening chapter. Which he'd written for the Buyer's Guide, I think, and then republished in Fawcett Collectors probably about a decade ago. But that was the first time I'd seen that. And there was that brief moment where, technically speaking, yeah, they had lost that copyright because of their relationship with McClure and the newspaper strip. And, Learned Hand and those other two appeals judges took one look at that and said, this is absurd. That's not what happened here. and reversed it, much to National's happiness. But just imagine, it's like Uslan and Ingersoll saying those columns, but just imagine what that would have meant if that had stood, right?
It was a premise for an interesting alternate history narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Brian, you've mentioned a couple of times the work of Bill Shelley, his biography of Otto Bender. And how much interaction did you have with Bill during the writing of Captain Marvel and the Art of Nostalgia?
A little bit. I actually had more interaction with Paul Hamerlink at Fawcett Collectors, who was very supportive and very helpful, and also Roy Thomas. Both of them. I had more direct contact since I've written a lot for them over the years now for Fawcett Collectors. I had more direct contact with them, but Bill was also very helpful and supportive. That book alone is. I'm sure you've probably all read it. It's a really great book. It was great to see it come back into print last year in that slightly updated edition that he did, which expands on the original from the early 2000s, because that's the definitive book on Bender. It really covers his whole career, and so that was a great starting point for me. But as far as the direct connection back to those figures, Paul, knew Beck and corresponded with him quite a bit. When he was a kid. So he was always helpful in sending me other letters and essays that I wouldn't have seen, and has talked for years also about writing a biography specifically on Beck himself. So hopefully we'll see that someday too. But yeah, all the folks that I interacted with that had any connection with the character or with those artists and writers were all very supportive and very encouraging as I was working on the project, which was very gratifying for me.
Well, on the topic of cooperative interactions with others, I'm curious about your experience, as others who do books that are comics related. What was your experience in getting permission to reprint the variety of the images that you include in this book?
Well, the thing with this is going back to what Gene had mentioned about the legal case. Those Fawcett comics those are public domain, the actual stories themselves. The characters are the property of DC and Warner Brothers, but the stories themselves, and I mentioned this at the end of the book, you can read all of Fawcett's output of the 1940s and 1950s if you go to the Digital Comics Museum. Mm-hmm. So the question of permissions for those really didn't come up, largely because, again, those stories themselves are not under that sort of copyright control any longer, because when, at least my understanding of it is that when DC bought the properties, they were first licensing them from Fawcett, of course, who had promised never to publish them again after the settlement in 53, 54. They bought the licenses, and this is paperwork I've never seen. This was in probably in the DC archives. It's probably still in existence somewhere. But what they bought were the characters and not the actual stories, which is why you'll see all those. That's what you'll see online. But to go back to that, the other thing that I'm always careful about whenever I write about anything comics related is that I try to follow fair use guidelines as much to the letter as I can. So if I'm going to be talking about an image, it's not just there for illustration purposes. If you take a look at the way I use the images in the book, any of them that are in there, probably with the exception of the toy ad, the flying Captain Marvel that I put in at the end of the book, everything else is talked about very carefully in the text itself. So they're not acting as illustrations, but they're actually acting as quotations.
Definitely.
And so that to me is really important. And I've said that to other colleagues of mine who run into problems with different publishers or different editors. And of course, it changes depending on if you're working for an American publisher versus maybe a UK publisher. But I'm very adamant in supporting and pushing the idea that these are quotations, that we shouldn't have to be paying for these images, because that's part of the copyright code itself. I mean, I've had these conversations with other editors, and I asked my dad about this to go back to my my questions that I had for him, and he said that's what that was established for. He said is to be able to use these pieces not to profit off of them, but to use them for scholarly purposes. So that's an issue also that Mississippi is very supportive of. Mm-hmm. And I had these conversations with my editor, with Craig Gill, very early on in the process. But was also in this case able to reassure him that if for no other reason, all that material is already sort of in the public domain. But I was still careful to attach the copyright symbols and to attribute all of that as best I could. But I'm very careful about that. Like I said, I don't use anything that doesn't have some kind of purpose in the text itself.
Right. And that's what I really appreciate about your use of images in this book, is that with almost every single one, you do a deep dive, really a close reading of the images and the text within those panels. And it not every comic scholar does that. I mean, there is something to be said for images that provide some kind of not necessarily feeling. Decorative. More of a tone.
Mood. Yeah. Tone.
Yeah. But you use those quotes in ways that, those of us with a background in more traditional literary studies use the quote, right?
Yeah.
So, we're writing about Mark Twain or Charles Dickens. We don't just plop a quote down, a block or even a short quote, to establish a tone of any sort. I mean, we use the words in order to pick them apart and to illustrate whatever points we're making. So why shouldn't we do the same in comic studies, which you do?
Yeah, and thanks. Yeah, and that's very purposeful, and that's why I won't. As much as I like essays or pieces where the image might be used for a mood or just for context, I won't do that in any of the writing I've ever done on comics. If I'm not analyzing it, I will not make any use of the image at all, because that's just my understanding of fair use, is that you have to be using it for analytical purposes, and if it's any other purpose, then you do have to pay for permission, and you've got to make sure you've got that permission. So I do treat it like quotations, and I also want to attend to the images themselves. One of the figures I mentioned in the Beck chapter is Otto Benisch, who's best known in art history circles for having written so much about Rembrandt's drawings. And as far as I'm concerned, if you're going to write about comics, people need to read Benisch in terms of how he deals with images and how he describes them and how he picks apart these drawings of Rembrandt's, because it's a masterclass in how to write about images effectively and within context. And so his work had a big impact on how I was writing about Beck, especially in that first chapter.
Kind of getting back to something you were talking about earlier with Derek's question about Bill Shelley.
Yeah,
it seems like one of the underlying narrative of this book too is Captain Marvel's role in the origins of comic studies.
Yeah,
and stuff like what Dick Lupoff was doing.
Sure. Yeah.
And so, kind of on top of some of the other archival research, could you talk some about that area of research, that those early days of what might be proto-comic studies, and what kind of seeds they planted for what we do today?
Oh, sure. I think when I was trying to think of how I would end the book, the original ending actually was the Steamboat chapter, the chapter on race and caricature, and I shuffled it around a little bit at the heavy revision stage after I got the reader reports, and so I needed another ending. And one of my readers had said, "Well, is it possible to go into the other variations on Captain Marvel, the non Beck and Binder one? So the Burgos one, right? The Captain Marvel that says split." Yeah. And his arms come off, and the Jim and the Stanley Gene Cole and Captain Marvel, and the Jim Starlin Captain Marvel, which I adore. But I wrote back to my editor and I said, that's not my book. I said that's a book on Captain Marvel as a name and a property. And so the more I thought about the ending, I said, well, actually, the afterlife of this character, or his kind of return, is in the fanzines. And what became interesting to me is when I went back and I reread All in Color for a Dime for the first time in years. I hadn't looked at that book in a long, long time, and it amazed me at how nostalgic the opening. I mean, maybe I should have remembered this better, but how the opening of the Lupoff essay, which is the first in that series from the Zero fanzine. That's the first in the All in Color for a Dime series when it appeared in the Lupoff's fanzine. It really does inaugurate comic studies in that form as one that's, as they say in the introduction of the collection from 1970, it's both bibliographic and historical and also nostalgic. So they announced that in the introduction to that collection of those articles in 1970. And I really thought of that and still think of that as a real foundation of everything that comes after. I think Bart sort of touches on that in Comics versus Art, but I think that work that was done in the early 60s, going back to the 50s with all the EC fanzines that Kiana Witt is working on, that's got to be acknowledged as an important foundational point for American comic studies. I really think that's significant, because if you don't, you lose out on a lot of other archival material that these people working outside of academia were trying to put together, simply because maybe they were fans, but they did approach it with a seriousness that I think is important for contemporary academics to see in order to understand how long this lineage has gone on for, and how much work was done by these really early figures like Pat Lupoff and Dick Lupoff and the Thompsons and those other fanzine figures from the early 60s. And again, he's all through it. For my research, it was also essential because that book, the All in Color for a Dime collection, is dedicated to Otto Binder. And so those overlaps for me became more and more fascinating, especially when I went back and read Lupoff's his essay, where he doesn't even talk about the character first. He remembers buying the comic with his brother in Florida in the winter of 1940, and he has a long description of eating the ice cream and buying the comic, and then he launches into this discussion of the character itself.
Well, do you think that in contemporary comics scholarship that there is not enough attention paid to that early kind of critical work that may have had more of an impact or been generated more by fans than of what we typically think of when we think of literary scholars or now comic scholars?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're starting to see more interest in it, particularly not only because of the archive at Michigan State, but also because of the Billy Ireland, who's in their collection not only of comics and comic art, but also of the fanzines and the underground comics. And as I just like I mentioned with Kiana working on her EC book, I mean, she's really dove into that. To that material also, which is really exciting. So I think that there's a lot of us, and Andy, I mean, you've done a lot of work, obviously, too, within these archives. I think of these early, I'm thinking of your article that's coming out in Inks, on the origin of the graphic novel term, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like And Gene, obviously, you're coming out of that world also, right? And know that material. So I think scholars of my generation, I think, have an awareness of that material, and I think at the very least are starting to excavate it more fully than perhaps it was in the past. And that may have just been a matter of the necessity of legitimating the field as a whole first before we could go back and dig that material up and treat it more seriously. Because I know even early on in this project, I talked with a colleague of mine and showed them the proposal I had, and they panicked when they saw it. This was right before I sent it to Mississippi, and they said, "There's no way you can use this material from those fanzines. That's not academically sound."
Oh, Jesus!
And I said, "Well, for the work I'm doing, that's what's there. It's totally sound. It has to be there.
That's the primary work.
That's the primary work." But this was a person, a very good friend of mine, coming from American Studies and American Lit, and was panicked for me. And they said, "They're not going to accept this." And I said, "Well, trust me, I think it'll be okay."
Like 20 years ago, when we were trying to put together our own research libraries, because the thing as an academic research library was very few and far between when it came to comics. You had like a dozen books from university presses. And then you had All in Color for a Dime. You had the Great Comic Book Heroes. You had eventually like Trina's books and stuff like that. Which are, but there was the line between scholar and academic. How do you draw that distinction, especially when you're talking about this kind of material? Now it looks very different right now. And somebody coming to the field now is going to look for the University Press stuff. Right. But like 25 years ago, University Press stuff was not there. If you wanted to do research on what people had said about stuff, you went to the fanzines, you went to the popular press, because that's where it was happening.
And that's what was out there. And I think, and I felt a responsibility, honestly, to that material also. And that's a lot of the other work that I do, where I don't want those voices to be forgotten. You know, so I don't want people like Richard Grass Green to be forgotten, and I don't want Trina's work with Kat Ironwood on women in the comics to be neglected, because I feel like it's important that we acknowledge that it doesn't all start, with the scholarship on Spiegelman's mouse, which is all important research, right? And it's incredibly groundbreaking. But that there is a body of work that exists before that is not only interesting but really exciting. I mean, there's so much that's still there, to be discovered and to be, like I said, excavated. And that's to me what's fun about finding all that material. I just find it really exciting to be able to stumble across these pieces that I was not familiar with, and hopefully other people that read the work that I've done or this kind of work will also get excited and want to search out this material.
Mm. I just live in fear all the time that somebody already wrote something in some fanzine that I'll never find, that's not cataloged, that already covers what I want to write about. We can check, because we can check, we check the MLA bibliography or whatever, see what the academic stuff is done. But unless you know somebody, or you email Roy Thomas or something and say, do you know if has anybody ever talked about this before? Right. I know when I was trying to, that was the thing with the Eisner stuff I was doing. I was trying to make sure that nobody had ever talked about that before. And one of the things I did discover is that all those guys talked about certain things like this amongst themselves.
Oh yeah.
But they said, one of them, I'm not going to name any names. One of them said to me, we always knew that Eisner's story about how he came up with the term graphic novel is bullshit. But none of them actually wrote it down. It was just in that community, they all kind of shared that understanding and talked about it all the time, but didn't record it.
I had the same experience when I was reading through all those back letters and the Binder letters. I was constantly panicking, like, oh, wait a minute, I wanted to say that, which is probably why I have so many damn footnotes in the book. I always tell people, read the footnotes. There's like 50 pages of them, but it was important for me to acknowledge that. But I also realized that when I would stumble across this material, if I didn't cite it and notate it and acknowledge it, that it would be lost potentially. So I think of the book itself like an archive, It's an archive in the way that's why I admire Benjamin so much, that I want people to walk into it the way Billy walks into the subway tunnel, and maybe they won't be interested in everything that's in the book, but maybe they'll find something in it that would give them an idea for their own work or for their own spin, not just on this topic, but on working in comics in general, or on memory studies.
One of the things too, I get the feeling about reading this book too, is that you're taking away from that early stuff is bringing in the personal. When you talked about the Dick Lupoff's, how that story that essay begins with his memory of buying Whiz Comics #2, that how much of your own memory and experience you bring into this book as well, which is a really nice, I think, a nice change from a lot of scholarship.
Yeah, and that wasn't, most of that wasn't in there in the first pass that went to the readers. And when I was looking back at it, I was lucky. I got a sabbatical from Harper to be able to finish the book and all the edits. And this was probably insane, but I took those 8 months and just decided to rewrite the whole book. I just did not, I kept
Why not?
it. Yeah, I was like, because I kept reading it, and then my partner Allison looked at the back chapter, and she's an editor. That's what she does professionally, and she looked at me and she said, "Is this really the book you want to write? Is this it? In this earlier version?" She said, "It's great. It's got a lot of sound academic research, but what book do you want to write?"
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, "Oh God!" I panicked, and I went back into my room, and I sat with the cats, and I pulled my oblique strategy cards, my Brian Eno card deck, and I thought about it, and then I said, "No, this is not the book I want to write." And again, one of my models, as I said, was Marianne Hirsch's book Family Frames, which has the chapter on Art Spiegelman, but also has all these narratives about her family photographs and her, the history of her family. And I studied with her as an undergraduate at Dartmouth when she was putting that book together. And so I went back in my memory and I said, well, could I do a book like that would actually incorporate these more personal narratives, because it's about nostalgia. So, why not? And then incorporate that into the comics history. And reading that Lupoff essay again was one of the things that gave me, I felt permission to do that, because, I think, as I say at the end, if that's a template that's possible in comic studies to intertwine the personal and these collective mythologies, as Svetlana Boym calls them when she's writing about memory, then would that be possible in the book? And so it was that, again, that combination of Hirsch's work and the Lupoff writing that really had me change my mind, and I felt, again, a greater freedom when I did the final pass, to incorporate the research I'd done on my grandfather and his experiences during World War II, and to incorporate that final photographic image. And I save it for the end, because my feeling is that I'll put all the kind of archival material first, and then if I hopefully have captured the reader, they'll trust me enough that when to quote from what Thierry Gernstein says, when I reach out that hand, maybe to the reader or to the child, that's the inner child that's reading this, they'll trust me enough that they'll go with me on that, I don't know. I just knew that if this was going to be my first book, I wanted it to be what I had envisioned it would be, and that included Kyler's cover, which is really the foreword to the whole book. I mean,
I was going to ask about that.
That was a
Kyler Roberts,
Kyler, who's just phenomenal. I mean, her work, I know you're all familiar with it, is just really stunning and forward thinking, and is autobiographical, but also has a complexity that it's easy to sort of dismiss, much like Beck's work, because it looks so simple what she's doing, even though it's very complex and very difficult.
And it also feels. So I was going to say, her stuff feels to me very not nostalgic ever. So it's a really interesting choice for this book.
I mean, she has a kind of resistance, because I knew I didn't want a superhero studies kind of cover, right? I didn't want like something that was trying to look like
Zap Pow.
Yeah, I don't want to have cows on it. I didn't want someone maybe trying to imitate Beck. I mean, again, to go back to the fair use issue, I wouldn't have been able to use those images on the cover, because those would be copyright and there would be for illustration. So I knew that was out of the question. And so I had a list of artists, and I thought about Kyler, and I said, I hope she'll be up for doing this, because I think this would be really exciting. And it was fun to talk with her about it, because I shared with her all these family photographs and all these old Fawcett comics, and so we were sort of sitting at her dining room table, and they were kind of laid out on the table like a map. And so when I saw the sketch that she sent me, which is the one you see as the frontispiece, I cried when I saw it because it captured so much of the book in a way that I hadn't anticipated. The way she not only incorporated some of the images of those family photographs on the cover, but even that image of this child, just gender neutral child looking into this mirror and having this experience refracted, to me seemed to capture not only so much of what I was trying to say about my own personal history, but also what I was trying to say about these once former children that I talked to in writing the book and what they were trying to recapture from this kind of misty past, And so I was really excited. And again, I treat it, and I've described the cover as the foreword. Like everything you need to know about the book is actually on the cover. So it's really not just a part of the packaging, but an integral part of the whole narrative itself.
Do you have the original framed?
No, I have what I have framed is the picture she did of my grandmother, which she threw in. She's like, "Do you want a picture for the dedication?"
She
page?
threw it in.
Yeah, I was like, "Yeah, that would be awesome." And she sends it to me. I'm like, "Oh my God, now I have a picture for the dedication page." But honestly, to go back to comics nerdiness, I also had the way that Gibbons and Moore set up Watchmen had a huge impact on me when I was a kid.
Yeah,
the fact that the cover was like the first page of the book, right? And then all those little pictures of the clock, with the blood dripping on them were more pronounced every issue. Like I that really was the first time I said, wait a minute, the cover should be part of the narrative, right? It shouldn't just be like a piece of packaging. So it's a kind of very distant allusion to that, my affection for Alan Moore and Watchmen.
Wow.
Well, the epilogue, I was going to say, the epilogue to me really feels like that's Dr. Manhattan sitting.
That's
on the
what I was going to say.
Yeah.
That's exactly what that is. It's not even like it.
Right. No, it's exactly. And I'm glad that you picked that up, because that's exactly, I mean, as I probably say in the book, the real nostalgia I have is also for Miracle Man. It's not really for Captain Marvel, right? Yeah. So when I read Miracle Man as a kid, and it just I probably was too young to be reading it, but that first issue where you go from the old story, and then there's the page where the panels increase in size, and he's quoting from Nietzsche, and he jumps into the modern story. I remember dropping the comic when I was 11 or 12 when I read it.
I don't know what this is.
Yeah, and I was like, I have to read that again. I mean, Moore definitely ensnared me at that point. But that ending is the way, even in his novel, which I just started in Jerusalem, where he's trying to collapse time. Which is magic, right? Mm-hmm. Which is what he's been trying to do now since he became a warlock, where he's trying to collapse past, present, and future into one sort of seamless continuum. And that's a total homage to him at the end of the book. Nice. I wanted to see if I could do that, not just with him, but also with W.G. Sebald, the German writer, is another big influence on me, and he does that in his narratives where he tries to collapse time itself, and so that's what that is. It's the book rewinding itself, which is also not something that was in the original. That was something that came up really at the very end of the process when I finished all the other revisions, and I still needed an ending. And I had one that was like, oh, here's how we could apply all this to comic studies, and and I'm like, no. That's not it. It didn't work. I even the writing was, it wouldn't move on the page or on the screen, But then I said, wait a minute. If I just bring all the characters from the book back, everybody, Beck Binder, Sabra Holbrook and the Youth Builders, my grandfather, Harlan Ellison, has to make an appearance. It seemed right. And of course, my mom gets the final line, the joke that ends the book.
So what was the press reaction when after they got the readers' reports and everything, you send them back this? A total rewrite.
I asked Craig when I was doing the revisions, like what he thought, because I laid all these ideas out. I said, I wanted to start like Citizen Kane, where it starts at the end. So we'll start with, the trial scene, and then we'll go backwards in time. Or I said it'll be like Richard Harris, like I say in the book, at the beginning of Camelot. and he said to me, he was really kind, as they all were, and generous. And he said, Brian, I got to sell books too. That sounds awesome. He said, go for it. He said, I trust you. I trust your judgment. He said, if I see anything I don't like, I'll let you know, but this sounds great. And he said, I'm excited to see what you come up with. And they liked it. I got lucky. I just tried to follow that instinct. which probably comes out of the creative writing training that I had too as an undergraduate. I mean, that was my initial background was, in studio art and creative writing, not necessarily in critical theory or critical studies. And so I think I'm at my best as a writer when I'm trying to incorporate that kind of material. But it also means that if you read enough of my stuff, it becomes kind of cliched, because after a while you're like, oh, now he's going to talk about Waterbury, Connecticut. And now he's going to talk about, when he bought that comic. So I have to be careful of that too, because I think it can become a little hackneyed, but I think in this book it works.
No, I think it's a good approach. And I think it's something that, our particular generation of comic studies people should kind of keep in mind. I mean, not to kind of dismiss people who've come to comics studies in some other direction, but I remember saying at a panel once, about making a transition from doing British modernism to comics, that I don't have a childhood fascination with Ulysses.
And if you did, we would worry.
but that and you quoted Gronstein earlier too, that nostalgia is such an important part for a lot of us,
right, in
doing this. So when I was reading this book, I really thought that you got that, like this really, when you're talking about writing, thinking about writing the book that you wanted to write. As I was reading the book, I kept going, "Oh, damn it! This is the book I wanted to write," or I want to take this model, and apply it to the things that I'm nostalgic about.
Yeah, and that's great to hear. I mean, as Gene knows, I also come out of a punk rock background, and I wanted that to be in the book too, that people could read it and say, "Oh, maybe I can do that." Or if they like it, maybe someone would read it and say, "Oh, this is terrible," and I never want to do anything like this. But if it resonates on some level with someone, I just hope one day my biggest goal is that it's on a library shelf somewhere, and some sad punker kid like I was as an undergraduate finds it and maybe finds something in it that resonates and gives them permission, the same permission that I felt I had to write this. That's important to me.
Well, it's really smart and it's really personal at the same time, and you don't see a lot of the personal in these books so much.
Right.
But it's not just, hey, this is me, but it's a very thoughtful, personal, self-reflective.
I think that comes not only from again the Marianne Hirsch book, which I can't say enough about her scholarship and the tremendous impact it had on me, not only as an undergraduate, but also as I went through grad school. But also, my graduate school training is in African American literature and theory, and so much of that work is also very personal, and engages not only with the theoretical, but also with life narratives. And a lot of my other major influences are people like Ralph Ellison or Toni Morrison and other figures who appear in the fourth chapter when I'm when I'm taking a look at some of the those images of Steamboat from the 1940s. And so I think that within that world that I was also trained in, there's more encouragement for that kind of personal narrative if it's done well. I mean, again, it can become very indulgent. And I'm always careful in my work to be cognizant of that and to understand the privilege that I have to be able to engage in those kind of narratives. But at the same time, that's the writing that I privilege and prize the most personally always weaves those two elements in. The archival with the personal, and those are the writers that I admire the most, and I wanted to have some of that in the book.
Yeah. And I think that as scholars, we're trained not to be personal, or at least that's been my experience. Now,
yeah.
Brian, a lot like you, my background, my training in graduate school and then after has been in, if not African American, then I guess broadly speaking, ethnic American writing. So there are, of course, tons of personal accounts, narratives, and whatnot. Nonetheless, throughout my education, even now, I find it very difficult for me, even if I am writing and I'm wanting to take my rhetoric into a more personal direction. There's a part of me that resists that just because of my training. And I can just imagine, and sometimes I'm aware of myself imagining, some of my mentors from graduate school especially saying, no, this is not the way that you do it, or let me rewrite this or retweak what you've written here.
Yeah, and I had that experience too, more so at the graduate level. And for me, it was paralyzing. I think there was a point I reached, this was about in the mid-2000s, where I'd published a little bit. But those voices in my head of probably partly from grad school that were well intentioned. I mean, again, for if you're going to go on the job market and you're going to try to get a gig, you've got to be able to write in very specific styles and formats. Mm-hmm. But I found that those kind of prescriptions really inadvertently hurt me as a writer, that I didn't know what voice I was supposed to use. And even in saying that now, when I say I was supposed to use, it took me a long time to actually develop the voice that I'm using now. And I give a lot of credit to Brandon Costello and Kiana for that, because they asked me to do that piece for Comics in the U.S. South on Walt Kelly. And I hadn't written anything for a while when I gave them that piece, and really struggled with it. Because I felt that I just couldn't write. I didn't know where I could incorporate what I thought I did well, which was this more personal narrative style with the archival, rigorous work that I also like to do. But somehow in writing about Kelly, who's from Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is 40 minutes from where I grew up, and seeing the personal qualities in Pogo, there was something about writing that essay, which doesn't have any personal material in it. It's very academic, and it's very third person and very sort of distant. But there was something in there that I'll quote Kafka here. It broke. It was like the axe for the frozen sea, right? That was inside of me. There was something about writing that piece that opened up a lot of the work I did after that. And I that's why in the acknowledgments I thank Brandon and Kiana for asking me to do that, because I think if they hadn't, I don't know what would have happened. I don't know if I would have continued writing at all, because like you're saying, Derek, I couldn't reconcile that kind of part of my training that said do not be personal with what I thought I did better, that I thought was my strength as a writer, and it had been told that was my strength as a creative writing student, though not as a lit student, as an undergraduate. So that was a struggle of many years before I could kind of hit upon a voice that I thought would work, or that at least I was happy with and hoped other people would be.
That's funny that you say that, because one of the things I was noticing as I was reading it, this may be partially having seen you read stuff from this also, but I could kind of hear your actual voice in my head when I was reading it, and so it does reflect that really personal quality of this, that it has even your cadence or whatever is there in it.
Yeah, and that was something I had to relearn, that cadence, because I did try to write it out of my style, and especially in graduate school, and even starting as an undergraduate, when I decided to become a hybrid creative writing English major, I had faculty that told me, well, you're too literary. I remember one faculty member telling me that. I said, what do you mean? I'm an English major. I should be right. He said, no, you're too. He said, I don't mean this in a bad way, but he said, you're never going to survive grad school. He said, you're not going to make it, because your writing is too, it's not he didn't say clinical, but I think that's what he meant.
Detached.
It wasn't detached. That's a better word. Yeah. It wasn't detached enough. And so I tried.
How dare you care?
Yeah. And he was right. I mean, I remember writing undergraduate papers where I was quoting Husker Du lyrics and Lou Reed in the middle of the paper on Shakespeare. So that was not good either. But
I want to read that.
Yeah, I'll see if my mom still has those. To go back to my affection for comics, I mean, I got into writing and reading because of comics, and because of reading all those articles in the Comic Buyer's Guide when I was 11 or 12, and reading Harlan Ellison's essays, which I often liked better than his stories when I was a kid. And so I really struggled with that because I think I had a voice, not a particularly good one necessarily, but I think I had one when I started as an undergraduate, and by the time I got into grad school, it was gone, because I didn't know how to balance the demands of a graduate education with the skill set that I already had. And again, it was really paralyzing, as I said before, for a while. I'm glad to hear that this one has that voice in it, because I really had to rebuild it and figure out what worked and what didn't. So that was a big struggle in the writing process, beyond any of the archival work or analytical work that I did for it. I was really trying to teach myself how to write. I have a note in a notebook that I started in 2010 or 11, where I said, if I'm going to write this, I have to relearn how to write. And that was part of my goal in doing this. And any of the other smaller pieces I've done in the last 5 years in parallel with the book was to try to relearn how to do this. And not only always to use a personal style. I mean, I've done pieces in the last year that are much more detached, but I think they still have the cadences, Andy, that you're talking about, even if they don't have the personal dimension that the book has.
Well, I feel like you gave me permission to do something with this book.
Yeah. And I'm happy to hear that, like I said, because it's, for many years I didn't feel like I had that permission, and it's not a good feeling, you know, and that was something I really did want to recapture in doing this project. And again, hoping that it would resonate somehow with readers and writers.
I got a weird question.
Yeah.
Brian's not only a writer and academic, he's also a visual artist and a musician. What's the right soundtrack to listen to when reading this book?
Well, you can listen.
What did you listen to when you were writing, if you do that? But what should we be listening to as we're reading?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so here's so typically in the mornings, especially on sabbatical, before I would start writing, because I can't write with any music on that has words in it, even if it's something I know really well. So I would start the day either with the Byrds, who are my favorite band of all time. So I'd start off, I'd have breakfast, I'd listen to the Byrds, or Gene Clark solo records. So Roadmaster was a big one when I was finishing the book. But then when I would actually start the editing process, it was all Brian Eno. It was all like music for airports and any of the ambient records, and Stars of the Lid, who are another great ambient group. When I was working on the World War II chapter, I did listen to the Ink Spots a lot, and to try to get into the right frame of mind, or like early Sinatra, like Tommy Dorsey era Sinatra. So that's a good one for that. And as you notice, probably in the 5th chapter, I have the gratuitous paragraph that mentions like Jimi Hendrix, Muddy Waters.
Yep.
Hawkwind, Bird, Bob Dylan band. And I was going to cut that. I'm like, no, I'm going to leave this in here. And if for no other reason that I know my old bass player buddy Tris out in Los Angeles, I know when he reads that chapter, he'll at least appreciate it. But as I only semi jokingly say in the acknowledgments, music is it's a life force for me. I like comics a lot, but music for me has always been kind of a driving force. And most of the people I'm closest to I've met through music. And so when I'm writing, I have to have that. And that might be where some of the cadences also come from, is listening to certain songwriters or certain musicians that I like a lot, so I wanted to find some way to incorporate that into the text. So not a weird question at all.
Okay.
I can give you more examples. I mean, I also got heavily into into my prog rock.
Oh yeah.
Phase that I'm still in right now. So all the Robert Fripp, because Fripp also makes very gnomic comments like Eno. So I'd read like Fripp's blog, in the morning, and then take inspiration from that and listen to a lot of King Crimson and that sort of stuff when I was working on it.
Excellent.
And Beck himself was a musician. That was so great about learning more about him. I mean, there's stories of him at San Diego Comic-Con with his guitar, showing up like Robert Heinlein. He's just there and everybody's listening to him and not paying attention to the other guests because he's so charming and singing his bawdy old songs, So that was kind of a nice little. And Binder also was a accordion player. I guess that's what they would do when they would all get together in the 40s and 50s, is they would jam. They'd get together in the basement, talk comics, and then play for a couple of hours. So that was kind of a nice connection.
I'll get in the same groove again.
Yeah, there's photos in Bill's book, right, of Beck and his wife Hilder singing and playing, and Binder with the accordion, and it looked like they had a good time.
One last thing that I consider myself fairly well read in the comics, but I don't remember ever running across Steamboat before.
Really?
Yeah, I mean everybody knows Ebony from The Spirit. I don't really remember hearing about Steamboat before.
That's amazing. Derek and Andy, what about you? Any? Well, Andy, I know you know about it.
We talked about
we talked about it.
We talk about Steamboat constantly. That's all we ever talk about.
Yeah, I'm aware of Steamboat, but I think what Gene is asking is endemic of at least the way that I see that when you're talking about representations of race, especially of African American figures in comics, then there are some like Ebony White that are just so egregious that they overshadow other instances, right? So in the case of Steamboat, that for many kind of recedes in terms of attention, if it gets any at all.
But the story about how Steamboat disappears is really interesting. I mean, that was fascinating.
Oh yeah, and that was, and I think I had come across that story in a couple of places because it's in Beck's the sort of autobiography that Paul put together for us, the Streetwise collection. For Tomorrow. So, Beck talks about it there. And I think Steranko might. I don't remember in his history books if he does. But this was another instance where Kiana was doing some research and she said, hey, do you have this article from the Chicago Defender on Steamboat and the Youth Builders? I said, no. I said, I've read a little bit about the Youth Builders, but I haven't seen any of the articles. So she sent me a copy of it. And then through that, I was able to trace back more about the Youth Builders as an organization, through the NAACP archives here at UIC in Chicago. And that's where I found a lot of that information. And for the listeners that don't know, the Youth Builders was that group of middle school kids that, as part of what basically would have been a kind of after school project, went into the Fawcett offices in 1945 and said, this character is not appropriate. It doesn't represent the African American community, and we'd like to see him removed from these comics that we otherwise really enjoy and love. And it's a really fascinating story, and it appears in a lot of the African American press from the period. There's a lot of articles on the Youth Builders themselves, which again were kind of like an after school program for kids in the New York City, initially in the New York City public school system, a way of teaching them democratic principles. And finding that material was also really exciting because I knew early on before I found it that I wanted a chapter on Steamboat because of other work that I had done, particularly that Pogo article on race and caricature in comics. So finding that material and the very principled way in which those kids pushed back against the arguments that even editor Will Lieberson was making, and he himself was fairly progressive. I mean, he always maintained that he also wanted to remove that character. He didn't particularly think it was appropriate for the comics. I think. As you're saying, I think one of the reasons that the character, or as Derek said, has been overshadowed is a lot of the conversation of that era is probably about Ebony, and not so much about Steamboat. And that's also maybe a factor that of the fact that those stories are not in print. I mean, you can read them online, but there's not been a lot of reprinting of the Captain Marvel stories in editions that are going to make people fascinated by these things and want to go back and discover them. But they're really horrific looking. I mean, the images that I give in the book are sum up, how the character was used and how the kind of blindness that both Beck and Binder have. If you read their commentaries on it, and Binder himself thought of himself as a pretty progressive figure, particularly writing stories like the Adam Link narratives, but really couldn't fathom why these characters would be understood as anything other than cartoon figures that have nothing to do with real life people, but that's the ideology of white supremacy, right? I mean, that's racism 101 in terms of how it works and how it produces this kind of almost willful blindness as to what the consequences are of deploying these kinds of images in narratives. So that was a fascinating part of the research for this book.
I was going to say that, and again, we know this the Eisner story so much because he kind of resists that. We know the idea that it wasn't really that bad, or it's what everyone else is doing, or whatever. But in the case of Steamboat, there is resistance from kids, and that resistance works,
right?
And why isn't that story out there more? That I thought that was really good to have that here, because sometimes voices can make a big difference.
There's a comment on, I think I cited in one of the footnotes that when Brian Cronin wrote about Steamboat on the Comic Book Resources website, there's an anonymous commentator in the comments feed that says this shows the story of the Youth Builder shows that there was resistance at the time. So these art narratives that, well, that's what everybody was doing, and it was just part of the era. As that commentator,
it's not that straightforward.
No, it's not that. It's much more complex. I mean, as Chip Kidd shows in his Shazam kind of coffee table book, they had an internal code that specifically said that there were not supposed to be racial or any demeaning images of races within the comics, and yet Steamboat, and yet there's Steamboat as a major character all the way through 1945, and he appears frequently. He's not a one-off character. He's there repeatedly, and again, after the war, they do address issues of racial prejudice, but they use Tawny. They use the Tawny character to do it. They don't bring Steamboat back, right? So he's totally gone by the end of 1945, and it's a feather in the cap of the Youth Builders. By all accounts, I mean, it was a really principled, as I said, really forward-thinking organization. And what was most interesting was reading their co-founder Sabra Holbrook's book, which is like a teaching manual, how to teach kids about what we would now call diversity, and how to teach them about fair play and democratic principles. So that was another twist that the narrative took that I wasn't initially expecting. Although that chapter was, along with the World War II, one of the parts that I submitted under as the proposal when I was first talking with the press. So that's one of the earliest parts of the actual narrative in the book.
Nice.
Something similar happened with Lil 8-Ball at Dell, right?
Huh.
That character was removed from New Funnies because of a protest.
Yeah.
And so that it's not just proves that stuff works, but I always think there had to have been somebody, there had to be. Eisner always denied that he never got any kind of organized complaints about Ebony. And when he did, they were always balanced out by praise.
Yeah.
Or, when he got individual complaints. But, if there were groups that were already going after Fawcett and Dell, I can't imagine they weren't going after Eisner too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, there's no way. Even looking at the records I saw of the Youth Builders, there's no way he wasn't getting some sort of pushback even at the time. Yeah. And that's, again, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, that's the kind of archival work that's so important and so exciting, to show that those voices are there. And that, again, comes out of the work, I did even on my dissertation when I was working on Oscar Michaud, the early African-American filmmaker. And one of my mentors was Pearl Bowser, the New York-based scholar. And she said these voices have to be heard. They're there, and to say that we don't hear them is not accurate. We're deliberately not hearing them, because the historical record is there, and we just have to do a little work and search for it, and we can find them and bring these voices back, like those of the Youth Builders, into the discussion.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the things I was looking for when I was going through the Eisner letters. I just wanted to find like a smoking gun of somebody complaining, and there were a few things, but I found what would be the opposite of a smoking gun, which is a letter from a group of kids in New Jersey who were forming a gang that they were calling the Ebonies.
Oh God!
And they were asking for like an illustration from Eisner to decorate their clubhouse.
Oh God!
Did he? Do you know if he responded to that?
He did. He said he didn't, but he didn't send them. He was happy to get that, but he didn't send them drawing.
Okay. Yeah. And that's where, the Miracle Man also came into the book, because, I was fascinated to see what Alan Moore did. Again, he said to me directly, he said, I didn't know about Steamboat when I did the Evelyn Cream character. but it's pretty clear that he knows the tropes well enough that when he's doing Miracle Man, he's going to go through all of those superhero tropes. So you have the black sidekick, but in his case, he tries to subvert it as he's writing about it in that narrative, just in the same way he subverts all the other sort of tropes of the Captain Marvel sort of mythology in that series. So that was another way to sort of combine those elements.
Well, Brian, I want to thank you for taking the time and talking with us about your new book, Captain Marvel and the Art of Nostalgia. This is something that came out just recently, and our listeners can easily find a copy. They can go to their, I guess, favorite bookstore. Definitely go to Amazon and do so. But it's a great read. And as we have discussed, it's one that not only is scholarly in tone, but it's one that is very readable, and not just for the personal touch that you bring to it. And that's not often that you can say that a scholarly text is also a nice read.
Thank you. That means a lot. I was hoping that I would succeed in doing that. So it's very good to hear that. So, and
we'll have to have you on again for like another 3 hours. We can talk just about nothing but Talkie Tawny, because we didn't get to talk much at all today, unfortunately.
He really is kind of the star of the book. So maybe next time we can. And, as I said, I know Harlan might get angry at me, but I'm not a fan of the Monster Society of Evil. As far as I'm concerned, the Talkie Tawny stories are the best.
A Talkie Tawny special episode of the Comics Alternative.
I'm there. If Talkie Tawny is not in the Rock, Dwayne Johnson, Captain Marvel movie, I will walk out and demand my money. I want that to happen. I'm gonna do everything I can to convince The Rock to put Talkie Tawny in the film.
How could you not have a giant barefoot talking tiger?
I mean, it's brilliant.
In a natty suit, or in the smoking jacket, or the bathrobe in his writer's garb.
And just imagine like Mickey Rourke playing him, right? Like that's my dream. World weary, but wise and kind, and also giving him these long monologues. I mean, what more could you want out of a film if you had that happening? So, if anybody wants to be a consultant on the film, I'm here in Chicago. They can contact me. So.
Okay, that was a lot more fun even than I was expecting, and I was expecting that to be fun. Brian is a really good thinker.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we were saying at the end there that I just want to reiterate too is that this is a really accessible book. So even if our listeners aren't, kind of steep in academia, it is really worth checking out.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So get your copy of Captain Marvel and the Art of Nostalgia. And if you get it through Amazon, well, you can help out the Comics Alternative by doing so. Go to our website, comicsalternative.com. Click on the Amazon link. It'll take you directly to Amazon.com. Get Brian's book. We get a few cents. It's neat how that works.
Yep.
It's like magic.
If you want to experience other kinds of magic, then also visit the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs, whether it deals with Captain Marvel or not. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about our interview with Brian. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
You can also get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com. And you can also reach us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Gene at comicsalternative.com, amazingly enough.
And we also have our Twitter feed, which is at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us. Let us know how we're doing and find out what we're doing.
All your internets belong to us.
That's right. And we like to hear from you guys through the various internets. So definitely let us know what you thought about our interview with Brian Cremins. Until next time, I'm Derek.
I'm Andy.
And I'm Gene. Take care.
See ya.